Salam and peace be upon you. My name is Mohammed Layiq Sediqi, the father of Holophase. Remember the language we are learning. There is one field, phi, the holophase. One continuous cyclic movement from which all of reality unfolds. When phi begins to change, its first derivatives appear, and with them, the three dimensions show themselves at once. A critical clarification before we proceed. In our shared journey, I have sometimes misspoken the names of these dimensions. Let me correct that now, definitively. The first dimension is time. Its symbol is the Greek letter omega, pronounced omega. The second dimension is space. Its symbol is the Greek letter kappa, pronounced kappa. I have previously used the simple letter K. That was an error. It is kappa. The third dimension is motion. This encompasses all flow, dynamics, and propagation. Its symbol is the Greek letter nu, pronounced new like new. I have mistakenly pronounced this as V. That was an error. It is nu. So they are time as omega, space as kappa, and motion as nu, built from both. Every higher derivative of phi is a finer question about how phi changes. And each one casts three shadows together: a time shadow, a space shadow, and a motion shadow. These echoes mix and weave into one another, forming the patterns we call fields, particles, bodies, thoughts, and worlds. In this picture, everything that exists is a living tapestry of phi, endlessly echoing through its derivatives and their dimensional shadows. Today, we confront the final, cleanest distinction. In this part 40, we confront the most subtle and insidious threat to epistemic clarity. We define the Tautology Detection Gate. This is the firewall mechanism that ensures a rule is a contingent, empirical discovery about phi, not a definitional shell game that cannot be false. The core revelation is logical. A rule that cannot be false is not physics, it is an analytic incantation. The skill you will gain is that of a conceptual auditor. You will learn to dissect any proposed law to ask the ultimate question. Is this a statement about the behavior of phi, or merely a restatement of the definitions we use to describe phi? Our core question is foundational. How do we ensure a law is contingent and empirical, not definitional? This question targets the deepest epistemic illusion, the confusion of conceptual necessity with physical discovery. A tautology is a statement that is true by the logical meaning of its own terms. All bachelors are unmarried men. It is necessarily true, but it tells us nothing about the world. It only clarifies our definitions. In science, the danger is a rule that looks deep, that involves omega, kappa, and nu, but upon inspection reduces to a similar identity. All phi patterns are patterns of phi. Such a rule is empty. It cannot fail, and therefore it cannot teach us anything new about phi. The firewall's tautology detection gate exists to root out these empty shells masquerading as profound laws. The tautology detection gate is necessary because the failure mode it prevents is epistemic sterility. An entire research program can be built upon a framework that is, at its core, a closed loop of definitions. It generates papers, predictions, and debates, but these are all internal to the language game. They never risk contact with the contradictory phi sentence. The program becomes a self-referential echo chamber, consuming effort and yielding no new knowledge of the holophase. By detecting and archiving tautologies, we quarantine them. We acknowledge their potential utility as tools for calculation or consistency checks, but we forbid them from being presented as evidence about the nature of phi. The formal meaning in holophase terms is a test of contingency. A real, synthetic law about phi must be contingent. It must be possible, logically and conceptually, for phi to behave otherwise. The rule must be vulnerable. It must be able to be broken by phi itself. A tautology, an analytic statement, is necessary within its defined terms. It cannot be broken without creating a contradiction in language. The core test is this. Is the law merely a rewrite of definitions? Could it be false without violating logic or the definition of phi? Let us apply the triunity lens. A tautology can be cleverly disguised by mixing omega, kappa, and nu symbols into a complex-looking equation. The detection test is, after simplifying the equation, after canceling terms that are defined in terms of each other, after substituting definitions, does the statement reduce to an identity like 0 equals 0 or A equals A? Does it say anything that a measurement of omega, kappa, or nu could possibly contradict? If the answer is no, we have a tautology. For example, consider a rule stated as the total informational flux through any kappa surface is conserved. This sounds profound, mixing space, kappa, and motion, nu, as flux. But if informational flux is defined as a quantity constructed from phi derivatives in such a way that Gauss's theorem, a purely mathematical identity, guarantees its conservation for any closed surface, then the rule is a tautology. It is true by the definitions of informational flux and Gauss's theorem. It is not a law of phi. It is a consequence of our mathematical bookkeeping. A real conservation law would state that a specific, independently defined measure of phi activity, one defined in terms of local omega, kappa, nu relationships, is found empirically to satisfy such a conservation equation. The tautology is in the definitional closure. The law is in the empirical discovery that a particular measure fits that form. This connects directly and critically to energy as tally. This demotion rule is essential for tautology detection. Many statements of energy conservation are empty bookkeeping identities. If energy is defined as whatever quantity is conserved under time translation, omega symmetry, then the statement energy is conserved is a tautology. It says, the quantity we define to be conserved is conserved. It tells us nothing about phi. For energy conservation to be a physical law, it must be falsifiable. This requires 1. Independent definitions. The forms of energy, kinetic, potential, thermal, must be defined independently of the conservation principle. Kinetic energy must be defined as half mv squared from mass and velocity measurements. Potential energy must be defined from force laws, like mg delta h for gravity. 2. Empirical testing. We then perform experiments in licensed omega kappa now windows where we measure all these independently defined forms of energy. We tally them. The law is the contingent empirical discovery that this sum remains constant within measurement uncertainty. It could fail. If we discovered a sealed system where our independently measured kinetic and potential energies did not sum to a constant, the law would be falsified. The energy conservation that is a tautology is useless. The energy conservation that is a synthetic law is one of the most powerful rules in science. The firewall must distinguish them ruthlessly. The operational interpretation of tautology detection is the practice of conceptual reverse engineering in theoretical physics and mathematics. It is asking, what part of this elegant equation is input, definition, convention, and what part is output, empirical constraint? It is the recognition that many beautiful, deep-looking theorems are in fact explorations of the consequences of our definitions, not discoveries about phi. The firewall role here is that of the definitional auditor. When a rule G is presented, especially one derived from pure theory or symmetry, The auditor performs the tautology check. She asks, if I imagine a world where phi behaves differently, does this rule logically force me to say that world is impossible? Or does it make a specific prediction about omega kappa nanu that could be contradicted by a phi sentence from that world? If the former, it's likely a tautology tied to the framework's axioms. If the latter, it's a candidate law. Let us formalize this with logical notation, spoken clearly. Let G be a proposed rule. It is a statement about phi and its derivatives. G of phi, dou phi over dou t, def phi, defined by D. We also have a set of definitions, D. These define our terms, our coordinates, our derived quantities like energy or momentum or information. The tautology check asks, is G logically equivalent to a statement that follows necessarily from D alone? That is, can we show that D different G is a logical necessity? If yes, then G is an analytic truth relative to definitions D. Its truth is contained within the definitions. It is a tautology. If no, if G is not entailed by D alone, then G is a synthetic statement. Its truth or falsity depends on something beyond our definitions, namely on the behavior of phi. It is a candidate physical law. The firewall's procedure is therefore to make all definitions D explicit, and then to see if the rule G can be derived from them without any additional empirical input. Now, the explicit prediction and falsification for this gate are unique because they deal with the rule's status, not its empirical content. Prediction for a synthetic empirical law. A real constraint must imply at least one observable omega kappa nu relationship that could, in principle, fail under a real regime change. It must make a contingent prediction. For example, a real force law predicts a specific relationship between an object's acceleration, omega nu, its position, kappa, and the position of other objects. We can imagine measurements showing a different acceleration. Falsification condition for a claimed empirical law. If no possible observation of omega, kappa, or nu can violate the rule, if any apparent violation can always be explained away by redefining a term within the rule itself, then the rule is not falsifiable. It is an analytic identity. Its classification as a physical law is falsified. The license consequence is not a downgrade of confidence, but a recategorization. What is allowed? You are allowed to create mathematically consistent frameworks. You are allowed to define quantities for bookkeeping. You are allowed to discover beautiful analytic identities within those frameworks. However, you must not present analytic identities as empirical discoveries about phi. They must be archived separately. What is forbidden? You may not present a definitional consequence as evidence for the truth of a physical theory. Use a tautological conservation law as proof that your theory is correct. Claim a rule is profound when it is merely a restatement of your own axioms. Shield a rule from falsification by continually redefining its terms after each failed prediction. What happens when the check fails? The license consequence is archival recategorization. Fail, archive separately as analytic invariant, useful for consistency checks, not evidence about nature. The rule is moved out of the licensed physical laws registry and into the analytic toolkit registry. It can be used for calculation, for checking the internal consistency of models, or as a mathematical constraint. But it cannot be cited as evidence that a theory correctly describes phi. It cannot be used to claim empirical support. Let us illustrate with a historical example that is both culturally specific and universally instructive. The intricate taxation and resource distribution system of the Durrani Empire at its height. The empire's administrators developed a complex rule, G-table, for determining the annual grain tax from a village. The rule involved the surveyed area of cultivated land, a kappa measure, the assessed yield per unit area based on soil type and seed, a new measure of productivity, a time factor for fallow cycles, omega, and the deduction for the subsistence needs of the farming family, a defined minimum. The rule looked empirical and precise. Tax equals land area times yield coefficient times time factor minus subsistence deduction. Now, imagine an auditor from the central divan, a conceptual auditor, examines this rule. He asks the tautology detection question. Is this a contingent empirical rule about agricultural production or a definitional shell game? He investigates the definitions. The yield coefficient for a region is not measured at harvest each year. It is a fixed number based on a decree from decades prior, tied to the soil classification. The subsistence deduction is not based on an annual census. It is a fixed per family number. The time factor is always 1 for active land and 0 for fallow land, as declared by the local landlord. The auditor then observes the process. The local landlord surveys the land, kalpa. He classifies it into soil types, which assigns the yield coefficient. He declares the fallow status, omega. He counts families for the deduction. He runs the calculation. The tax is determined. But here's the key. The landlord's declaration of what is active land and what is fallow is not checked against independent evidence of actual planting. The soil classification is not verified. The number of families is not audited. The final tax number is then taken as the correct assessment. The auditor realizes the rule GTAR is tautological within this closed system. The tax liability is not an independent empirical fact about the village's agricultural output that is discovered by the rule. It is defined by the landlord's inputs. The rule is merely a formula that translates the landlord's declarations about kappa, nu, omega into a number. It cannot fail. If the harvested grain is less than the tax demand, the rule is not considered wrong. The villagers are simply deemed to have failed to meet their obligation, or the yield coefficient is silently considered aspirational. The rule produces a number, but that number is not anchored to an independent fee sentence, the actual harvested grain in the storehouse. Falsification condition met. No possible observation of actual harvest, the real fee pattern of grain production, can violate the rule, because the rule's key parameters are defined by fiat in the moment of assessment. It is an analytic identity within the administrative language game. The tax is what the formula says it is, given the declared inputs. License consequence. The rule GTAC is archived as an administrative analytic. It is a consistent formula for generating a number from a set of declarations. It is not a law of agricultural production that provides genuine knowledge about the empire's resource base. To get a real law, you would need independent measurements, actual harvest weights, fee sentences, compared to independent measures of land area, rainfall, omega, and seed type. The rule would then be contingent. It could fail if your predictive model was wrong. This example reveals the universal structure. A tautological system is a closed loop of definitions that generates impressive-looking outputs, but is unanchored from independent fee sentences. It confuses internal consistency with external truth. In modern science, a classic example is certain formulations of the principle of least action. In its profound empirical form, it is a synthetic law. You postulate a specific form for the Lagrangian, a function of omega, kappa, and nu coordinates, and then the principle that the action is minimized predicts the actual paths particles take. This can be falsified. You could imagine a world where a different Lagrangian is needed. However, if one defines the Lagrangian as whatever function, when minimized, yields the observed paths, then the principle of least action becomes a tautology. It says, the paths are the paths that come from minimizing the function that yields those paths. Empty. Another profound example is the blue claim that markets are efficient. In its tautological form, the efficient market hypothesis, EMH, can be stated as market prices fully reflect all available information. If available information is defined post hoc to include whatever information seems to have moved prices, and fully reflect is not given an independent testable definition, like the impossibility of systematic profit above risk, then the EMH is a tautology. It says, prices are what they are because of the information that made them that way. It cannot be falsified. To make it a synthetic empirical theory, one must independently define information, for example, corporate earnings reports released at time t, and make a testable prediction about price movements, omega, and their relationship to that information flow, nu. Then it can fail, and often does. The skill you gain as a conceptual auditor is the ability to spot these closed loops. You learn to ask of any grand rule. 1. What are the independent definitions? Are the key quantities defined on the left-hand side and the right-hand side of the equation independently of each other, or are they defined circularly? 2. Where is the empirical hook? At what point does this rule bite into a phi sentence that is not of its own making? What measurement could, in principle, break it? 3. Is failure possible? If the rule fails, would we revise our picture of phi, or would we just tweak a definition to make the failure go away? This skill is the last defense against grand, empty theorizing. It enforces the discipline that every term in a physical law must ultimately be cacheable in the currency of omega, kappa, and nu measurements that are defined outside the law itself. Let us reiterate the core epistemic axiom that this gate protects. Rules do not become real by elegance, consensus, or tradition. They earn a license only by surviving falsification, variation, independence, and scope discipline. A tautology survives falsification trivially, by being unfalsifiable. It therefore earns no license as a physical law. It violates the very first criterion, and the corresponding firewall action. When a rule fails, we do not believe harder. We tighten, downgrade, or retire its license. When a rule is detected as a tautology, we do not admire its elegant self-consistency. We archive it in a separate category. We retire it from its pretended role as an empirical truth-bearer. Let us now crystallize the epistemic function of this part 40. We have defined the tautology detection gate. This is the firewall's final filter, ensuring that only contingent, synthetic statements about phi are licensed as physical laws. It mandates that for a rule to be empirical, it must be falsifiable. It must imply specific omega, kappa, nu relationships that could, in principle, be contradicted by phi itself. Rules that are true by definition, analytic identities, are archived as useful formal tools, but stripped of empirical authority. The firewall acts as the definitional auditor, relentlessly asking, what part of this is discovery and what part is definition? The explicit prediction for a real law is contingent falsifiability, the existence of at least one imaginable but non-actual omega, kappa, nu observation that would break the rule. The explicit falsification condition for a claimed law is unfalsifiability. If no such observation is possible, the claim to empirical lawhood is false. The license consequence is recategorization to analytic invariant, removing the rule from the ledger of empirical discoveries. With this gate, the epistemic firewall's primary architecture is complete and sealed. We have built a system that 1. Validates rules against phi sentences. 2. Diagnoses their pathologies. 3. Audits their inferential structure for robustness. 4. Tests their generality across regimes. 5. And now, verifies their very status as empirical claims, banishing tautological shells. This creates a protected space where only rules that are contingent, robust, general, and anchored in phi can survive and be built upon. However, a final adversarial thought now arises. We have built a stronghold with clear gates. But what if an adversary, a clever but misguided theorist, or simply the human capacity for self-deception, engineers a rule specifically to pass these tests? What if a rule is crafted not to reveal phi, but to mimic the signatures of a good law while being, at its heart, empty or wrong? A rule that is adversarially robust to our firewall. The gates we have built are necessary, but are they sufficient against a purposeful agent who knows their design? Now we face the adversarial world. Rules can be engineered to pass tests. Salam, and peace be upon you.